Tonight, chiefs from the Atikamekw Nation meet in Montreal after their request to meet with the Premier last week was denied.
Indigenous peoples, even those in this chamber, including myself, have experienced racism throughout the history of Canada.
Independent MP Jody Wilson-Raybould asks what actions Indigenous Services will take after the death of Joyce Echaquan.
We didn't feel comfortable sending our children to be part of the social experiment that they're having currently in our provincial schools, so we decided to do an alternative.
And we meet Manitoba parents who are homeschooling their kids during COVID. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Over the weekend, the Quebec government announced that Joyce Echaquan's death will be subject of a public coroner's inquiry. The announcement came from Quebec's chief's coroner following an outcry by First Nations leadership. No word yet on an exact timeline for that report. Meanwhile, a group of Atikamekw chiefs were in Montreal today to meet with Quebec Premier François Legault. APTN's Lindsay Richardson met with some of the Atikamekw National Council to find out how it went.
We're joined now by Grand Chief Constant Awashish from the Atikamekw National Council. They've just come out of a meeting with Premier François Legault, and they're describing their feelings to be optimistic but cautious. So, Grand Chief Awashish, thank you so much for joining us. Can you just describe for us what the meeting was like this morning and what you feel was accomplished?
I think we had on both sides a mission to accomplish about the discrimination. Of course, there's a notion of systemic discrimination that not everybody agreed on, but me, I still hold on my point of view, and many people and experts still hold on that point of view. It's not saying that everybody is racist. By admitting that there's a systemic racism against First Nations, it's not admitting that people are racist. It's just how everything was built on. Was built on the inferiority of First Nation, and put aside First Nation so we can grab on what First Nation own. So based on that, many bad thought about First Nation growth with time, with the history. Some people would feed those kind of mentality. And I think that's what we didn't agree on. It's the systemic, but I felt that he was listening, and now we're going to look forward for what he agreed for. He said he needed action. He wanted to do action. Just
over the weekend, they announced that there would be a public coroner's inquiry. Yeah. What do you feel can be learned from that we haven't already learned from, say, the MMIWG inquiry report or the Viens Commission report?
Well, I think, again, it's a good thing, but of course there's so many reports about First Nation. Government should know what to do by now with First Nation. What we ask about that is we need to have someone who can be an observer in the process. He was going to look into it, and now we're going to wait for answer.
One last question for you. The death of Joyce Echaquan has mobilized Canadians, everybody around the world. Yeah. What do you think that non-Indigenous Canadians can do to better support First Nations or even Joyce Echaquan's family now moving forward in this?
Well, I think it's to learn a little bit more about the history of First Nation, all the different culture, languages. Go to just read books about First Nation. Go to event, art exposition about First Nation. Just go get the taste of what it is to be a First Nation, and try to put the goggle of First Nation has when they speak about themselves and when they speak what they went through. That's all we need. We need people to also, when they see racism happening, not to close their eyes, but to say, hey, it's enough. Let's move on and let's create a better society that our children deserve.
There we go. Very well said. Chief Awashish, thank you so much for joining us. Now, just to remind you, there is no set date for when we will be receiving that public coroner's report, but we'll be continuing to cover the story as it unfolds. Back to you.
Thanks for that, Lindsay. Joyce Echaquan's death continued to be on the minds of some parliamentarians as well. Independent MP Jody Wilson-Raybould rarely gets to stand up in question period, but today she did, and pressed Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller about Echaquan's death.
Indigenous peoples, even those in this chamber, including myself, have experienced racism throughout the history of Canada. Racism occurs in all sectors of society, including governments and political parties. This must change. To the Minister, do you agree that not nearly enough has been done by your government to combat Indigenous-specific racism? Assuming you do, what new concrete and specific actions will you take to combat it? Will you call it out always, and not only when it reaches the front pages?
The Honourable Minister.
This traumatizing and dehumanizing event that occurred in the death of Joyce Echaquan was an expression of the absolute worst face of racism. Systemic racism in our healthcare system is a national problem, and we must face the reality that our institutions continue to fail Indigenous peoples. It's essential that there be a timely, transparent investigation. We welcome Quebec's decision to act swiftly on the inquest. We know that this is not limited to the healthcare system and expresses itself across all institutions of government. And while much has been done in the last 5 years, much more remains, and we'll continue to work on it diligently and call it out wherever it occurs. I thank the member for her question.
The CEO of a Northern Wellness organization in Manitoba, who is also a Saulteaux Métis longtime physician, is calling for criminal charges against the nurses heard on that Facebook video berating Echaquan with racist taunts as she died.
I have to tell you that we're moving from the conceptual idea about anti-racist training as learning to prosecution. And in the case of that young woman of 7 children, she was killed. And because she's a human, we can name it murder. So my official response to that is prosecution of the 2 nurses who denied her access to health care.
That was Dr. Barry Lavallee, who I spoke with earlier today. APTN's web reporter Brett Forrester has been following this matter, and he joins us from Ottawa to help us make sense of what options are out there and what they would mean in the context of calls for justice. Brett, people called for a public inquiry almost immediately after this happened. That call has been answered. What should we make of the province's decision to call an inquest?
Yeah, so right off the bat, you can note that Quebec can say that they are taking action. And the thing to bear in mind about coroner's inquests is that they are fact-finding missions. So they are public hearings. They take place in a courtroom. They will summon witnesses, and this will take place in front of a jury. But what they will examine, is pretty narrow or limited in scope. They will look into the circumstances surrounding Joyce Echaquan's death, and they will, in this case, offer recommendations. And these are essentially policy options on how to avoid situations like this in the future. But there are some things to remember, and that is what this is not. This is not a provincial public commission of inquiry. Quebec, of course, just had one of these that issued its final report last year, and that's known as the Viens Commission. And they had over 100 recommendations that dealt with similar issues to this. And the coroner's inquest is going to add to that list of recommendations. So now the key, a lot of people would say, is to implement those recommendations and move forward that way.
What can Joyce Echaquan's family expect to get out of this coroner's report?
So I asked this question to a cousin of Brian Sinclair, who died tragically in a Winnipeg hospital after seeking medical attention. And they eventually pulled out of the coroner's inquests because they felt the scope was too narrow. And I spoke with the president of the Indigenous Bar Association, Drew Lafon, who explained that the coroner's investigatory tools are relatively limited, and they often leave families feeling like justice has not been served or still seeking answers. And that's because, again, a coroner's inquest, it's not a criminal proceeding. There won't be any charges laid as a result of this. It's purely a fact-finding mission with a limited mandate.
When speaking of criminal charges, lots of people are calling for criminal investigation and charges in connection with this. How would something like that figure into the inquest process?
And this is the key thing that we're all watching going forward. So under Quebec's Coroner's Act, if and when somebody is charged with an indictable offense stemming from this incident, this will essentially put the coroner's inquest on the back burner. So what's happening right now is that the coroner is investigating, likely cooperating with local police. And if police decide to charge somebody as a result of the death of Joyce Echaquan, the coroner's inquest will have to wait because, as I said before, it's not a criminal trial and it's not a criminal proceeding. So the outcome of any criminal investigation will likely be submitted as evidence at the coroner's hearings.
Well, something that we'll all be watching as this all unfolds before us. Thanks so much for joining us, Brett.
Thanks.
We need to take a quick break, but here's a look at what's coming up after the break. A call to action to help struggling Indigenous businesses in the Yukon.
We're not necessarily represented, certainly not in retail space, but also in many industries.
Welcome back. A Mi'kmaq-owned fishing boat went up in flames this morning. It happened in Comoville, Nova Scotia, a less than 5-minute drive to the site of a weeks-long dispute over lobster fishing. The boat was heavily damaged and is owned by Mi'kmaq fisher Robert Alexander Siliboy. Firefighters were called to put it out at 6 a.m. local time. It's not currently in use due to mechanical issues, but the RCMP confirmed that the fire is suspicious, although they say that the cause is still being determined. Mi'kmaq fishers have been exercising a treaty right to fish for a moderate livelihood this past month. Like most other retailers, Indigenous-owned businesses have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, a group of Indigenous women business owners are calling on major Canadian retailers to lend a helping hand. Here's Sarah Connors with that story from the Yukon.
This will be okay, but obviously sales are so much less, especially without the tourism.
It's been a tough year for Nacho Nyaktan soap maker Joella Hogan. With few tourists in the Yukon this summer and no cruise ships, business has been bust.
It was really, I guess, a punch in the gut because I realized how much my business really depends on tourism and the cruise line industry, because so many of the shops that carry my stuff are also supported by that industry.
Along with 20 other Indigenous women entrepreneurs, Hogan is now calling on major retailers to pledge 15% of their shelf space to Indigenous-owned businesses and help those struggling from the pandemic get back on their feet.
We're not necessarily represented, certainly not in retail space, but also in many industries. And so how do we encourage and support retailers to make that shift and support small businesses, because realizing the impact is so much larger when you invest and support Indigenous business.
Inspired by a similar pledge in the U.S. after the death of George Floyd, entrepreneurs like Hogan say it's time for Indigenous businesses to reap the profits, which usually isn't the case.
People are selling items with Indigenous graphics or images on them which aren't appropriate or Indigenous made, and so you're not supporting Indigenous people and communities when you're retailing those products.
Indigenous-owned brands are almost non-existent in the major Canadian retail space. Hudson's Bay Company, for instance, which carries about 1,800 brands, only carries one Indigenous-owned brand. And other major retailers like Simon's, Holt Renfrew, and Shoppers Drug Mart don't carry any. And while local shops like this one have been supportive, most major retailers have not responded to the pledge.
Some of them have made statements on them, some of them haven't. Some of them are mute, which is pretty disappointing because there's so many opportunities.
Despite the lack of response, Hogan says it's the message, not the money, that makes the pledge worth it for retailers.
There are so many beautiful things that are coming from Indigenous communities, and how can we as Canadians support that so that all people can thrive?
Most companies I reached out to about the pledge did not get back to me. However, Hudson's Bay Company did tell me a diversity and inclusion task force is now in the works. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
For many teenagers leaving the foster care system, it can be challenging. But they have rent and bills and food to worry about while still going to school. Tina House has the story of how a newly formed fund in BC is helping those kids in need.
20-year-old Jody Decker is enrolled in Douglas College and dreams to one day be a social worker, working with other Indigenous families on reserve. Decker's life has not been easy. Originally from the Atikamekw Nation in Manitoba, she was raised mostly in BC. She was put into foster care at age 12 and in 7 years was placed into 8 foster homes.
It was difficult for me because I didn't have a stable piece in my life other than school, so school was like the place I liked being the most.
Like all kids in foster care, once Jody turned 19 years old, it was time for her to be on her own. But at first, it was tough financially, and that's when she heard about the Youth Futures Education Fund. The $350,000 fund was established by Coast Capital Savings and the United Way of the Lower Mainland. It's open to all kids who have aged out of the foster care system and who are on a tuition waiver program. It helps with living expenses. Kim Wenchel is with the United Way of the Lower Mainland. She says her organization is proud to help people like Jody reach for her goals.
It really came about because we were hearing from former youth in care that they could access post-secondary tuition, but they couldn't access their living expenses. And so they were having to work They were having to work 2 and 3 jobs to pay for their living expenses, and so we heard many stories of former youth in care who would go to school one semester, take a semester off, go to school one semester, and as you can imagine, that's really problematic when they're trying to get their education.
For Jody, this fund has been a lifesaver. She now has her own place with her kitten George and goes to school full-time. She also has a part-time job. She says she couldn't be happier and more excited for her future.
I don't have to worry about student debt, and I don't have to worry about rent, and I don't have to worry about my next meal, and that has helped me become the person I am today. I'm not homeless, and I'm grateful for that.
Over 1,500 kids have accessed the program, and 26% are Indigenous.
We've heard success stories of former youth in care getting degrees in everything from medicine to social work to sciences, and really being our next leaders of tomorrow. So it's been really exciting for them.
Tina House, APTN National News, Coquitlam.
Love that story. Okay, it's time for us to take another break, but there's more news ahead, including parents who skipped the back to school in the classroom in favor of homeschooling their children.
We try to emulate the school day as much as we can. We have 2 breaks and a lunch. We start at 9, we end at 3:30, and then various days have different kinds of courses.
Welcome back. Not many First Nation communities in Canada have enough people or traffic to warrant traffic lights, unless you're from the big places like Six Nations in Ontario or Ganawage next door to Montreal. But up in northern Manitoba, the remote community of Norway House Cree Nation has installed their first set of traffic lights. It's just at one intersection for now, but is this a signal of what the future holds for the community of 8300? And thanks to Toby Wilson for these pictures. The lights officially went up in mid-September. Now let's take a look at Tuesday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. 17 and rain for Fredericton, 17 and sunshine for Charlottetown. La Grande River, some cloud and 9 degrees. Kuujjuaq, 7 and rain. Gaspé, 17 degrees and sunshine, 18 and sunny for Montreal. North Bay, rain and 13 degrees. Sault Ste. Marie, 14 and showers. Sioux Lookout, 11 and showers. Kapuas, Casing and Timmins, 12 and showers. Puckatawagan, some flurries possibly, 6 degrees. Mix of sun and cloud, -1 up in Churchill. 17 and showers for Winnipeg Dauphin, some rain and 20 degrees. 18 and sunshine for Saskatoon and Regina. 19s for Estevan and Swift Current, sunny skies. Stony Rapids, 6 and snow. Buffalo Narrows, 12 and some showers. 9 and rain for Fort Chip. 15 and sunny skies for Peace River. Edmonton, sunny, 17 degrees. 25 for Lethbridge and sunshine. Penticton, 23 and sunny. Same with Kamloops. Campbell River, 21 and sunshine. Prince Rupert, 13, mix of sun and clouds. 13 and mostly sunny for Fort Nelson. 8 and some showers for Dawson City. 10 and showers for Whitehorse. Norman Wells, showers and 6 degrees. Same with Wauti, 14 in Trout Lake. Inuvik, snow, same with Tuktoyaktuk actually. Snow and 2 degrees both for those communities. Nauyot, 0 and snow. Chesterfield, 0 and sunshine. Igloolik, 0 and snow. Same with Clyde River. Pangertung, 1 and some flurries. With the start of school in full swing during the COVID-19 pandemic, some families opted instead to homeschool their children. In Manitoba, homeschooling has nearly doubled compared to last year, and as Brittany Hobson shows us, Indigenous families are using this opportunity to come up with a more culturally appropriate curriculum.
Recess is over! This year, Laura Forsyth, along with her sister, have chosen to homeschool their kids due to the pandemic.
We saw in August, mid-August, the rise of COVID cases that were happening in the city of Winnipeg and in the province of Manitoba. And we didn't feel comfortable sending our children to be part of the social experiment that they're having currently in our provincial schools. So we decided to do an alternative.
The Métis family has 6 kids in total, ranging from grades 3 to 7. The home has been converted into a makeshift classroom, with each kid getting their own desk and cubby space.
We try to emulate the school day as much as we can. We have 2 breaks and a lunch. We start at 9, we end at 3:30, and then we various days have different kinds of courses that we take. We take 5 a day, so it could be social studies, math, science. We have phys ed, they do dance, French class, and so we do a variety.
With homeschooling, now they are able to provide specialized classwork as they need to.
Take these words here, read the sentences, and find the word that best fits. They're at their own pace. No, we don't need to rush to go with the herd. They get to slow down and really understand a concept before moving on to the next thing. And then in that, we get to see the strengths that they have, and then also some of the opportunities.
You decided saying that? Okay. So you have to spell the word to first before you spell amber.
Approximately 85 kilometers away in the small city of Portage-la-Prairie, Amber Bolio is homeschooling her twin daughters, as well as her brothers, with help from her mom. Today's lesson begins with journaling, and will eventually incorporate lessons not always found in the history books.
In residential schools, when there was kids that went to the residential schools who were Indigenous, that's what the residential schools were for, Indigenous peoples. So they went there and they wouldn't let them speak their language and they would cut their hair.
There's a big emphasis on land-based learning, as well as learning the Ojibwe language. This is the first time it's been included in the kids' classwork.
And to some extent, we were teaching them the basics, but I feel like this is really an opportunity for us to teach them how to be fluent in their own language.
Bolio says converting to homeschooling was a difficult process in the beginning.
You have a lot of reading materials on the Manitoba website, but there's not a lot of direction on what to do. There's zero funding available for parents who want to homeschool their children, which is just a tragedy at this time, especially with everything going on.
Despite this, Bolio stands by her decision to protect her family. Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Well, that is your news to kick off the week. If you've missed anything in the past few days, of course, you can catch up on APTN News app or aptnnews.ca. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.